Welcome back. Author, speechwriter, columnist, and conservative strategist David Frum has never been afraid to share his thoughts. Some of his thoughts concern terrorism, extremist faith, and presidential nominees. Here's part 2 of our exclusive interview with Frum, whose latest book, Comeback: Conservatism That Can Win Again, is now on shelves. One thinks of terrorism, one doesn't automatically think of places like Pakistan that seems to be housing, obviously Osama bin Laden, but many of the most extreme madrasas in the world are in Pakistan.
There's no country in the world that has suffered more from terrorism, I think, than India. And much of that terrorism, they blew up the Bombay train system, they attacked the Indian Parliament, they blew up the Parliament House in Kashmir. Many of those terrorist groups are supported by Pakistan.
Yeah, and yet there's the complexity of saying we, the West, America, helped fund these extremists in their fight for the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Well, look, there are people, it is true that the United States has always, in its foreign policy, had to make choices of lesser evils. So in order to defeat Hitler, they aligned themselves with Stalin. In order to defeat the Soviets, they aligned themselves with some of the Afghan religious extremists, with Saudi Arabia, and with Pakistan. Now there are new problems. But given at each time, I mean, it was not irrational to ally with Stalin to defeat Hitler any more than it was irrational to try to defeat the Soviet Union by working with the Afghans. There are still people who are so angry at the Cold War, who are so instinctively, if not sympathetic to the Soviet Union, hostile to anybody who was hostile to the Soviet Union, that they invoke this as a debater's point. But seriously, is it to be suggested that the United States should have allowed the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan and not respond? I don't think so.
As you look at the outcomes, possible Democrat president in the end of 2008, is there one candidate that you are more worried to take power?
Well, there are two. There's at this point two leading Democrats,
Yeah.
Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And from my point of view, if I have to choose a Democratic nominee, I'd rather see them choose Hillary. For these reasons. One, I think she is more beatable. Barack Obama is more attractive. Two, I think she's less left-wing. And three, I think just temperamentally she's more cautious. And I think Barack Obama would be much more ambivalent about the American role in the world, much more willing to take big risks at home, much more willing to try to launch big new social programs, and more electable because he doesn't come with all the ethical and personal baggage that the Clintons do.
Yeah, and yet there is obviously something very attractive about Clinton, because she's tried, she's got some experience. Barack Obama doesn't have as much experience in this.
Oh, I don't think either of them really have very much experiences. The comedian Chris Rock said recently, he was doing a show in which he was talking about, does Hillary have experience? He said, look, Chris Rock said, I've been married to my wife for a dozen years, and yet if we were to bring her on the stage and she were to tell jokes, you wouldn't laugh at all. Being married to a comedian doesn't make you a comedian. Being married to a president is not the same thing as having presidential experience.
Let's talk about Canada for a minute here, because is conservatism different in Canada than it is in the United States? You live in both places. You understand these dynamics.
Conservatives in Canada face some very different challenges. I mean, one is the problem of management of the Federation is a problem that largely no longer exists in the United States. It's a very real problem in Canada. Second, Canada has much less margin for error. So Canada can afford many fewer mistakes than the United States does, and that makes everybody more cautious. Finally, Canada doesn't have the international responsibilities that the United States does. I mean, right now, Canada is engaged in a very serious campaign in Afghanistan, but the problem of how do you maintain the peace of the whole world is not something that Canadians need to think as hard about as Americans do. But I think one of the things that has inspired me in this book is very much the Canadian conservative experience in two ways. One is it's hard for Republicans after 30 years of such success to feel what it is like to lose. Those of us who experienced 1993 know what defeat feels like and know how difficult and prolonged it can be to recover. Second, I think the Canadian Conservative Party, in recovering from 1993, has gone through many of the changes I advocate in the book. They have worked their way to integrating environmentalism into their message. They have got an economic message aimed more clearly at the middle class than the Republican message has been in recent years. They have come to a better balance between the secular and the religious that the Republicans have.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I want to talk about that because it seems that issue is different, again, played out in Canada than it is in the United States. Seems like religion is a very polarizing issue in the States, and yet everyone is claiming religion as a very important thing. Not as much in Canada.
Not as much in Canada. Look, I think one of the things that is driving a lot of the social conservatives in the United States is they correctly perceive that the disarray of the family has become a major barrier to personal mobility and social equality in the United States. Whether or not a child whose father and mother are married is going to do better across a whole range of life outcomes than a child whose father and mother are not married. The children of unwed parents, the children of divorced parents, suffer a range of negative social outcomes to the point where marriage is becoming a major class marker, a barrier between one class and another. And since the children of people whose parents don't remain married are themselves having more difficulty marrying, we've got now what is becoming an inherited barrier to social mobility. So the social conservatives are right to say that this issue of marriage is crucial. I mean, it's in many ways as crucial in our time as the spread of college education was after World War II to sustaining a middle-class society. Canada does not have as many of these social problems as the United States does. But the American social conservatives who focus on this are right. Some of their answers, however, are not right.
Interesting. What role does religion play in politics? I mean, for yourself, do you bring up your own faith stuff when you talk about issues of politics? Does that inform you?
I try, when I think about politics, to look at things through a pretty empirical lens. I'm here in Vancouver as a guest of my friends at the Fraser Institute, and they have their motto, if it matters, measure it. And that's very much my view. I think people are shaped by who they are, of course, but we have to be very careful about using religion as an organizing tool in politics. And we have to also be careful about allowing faith to substitute for information. And I think one of the legacies of the Bush government is going to be that the use of the term faith-based as applied to policy making is going to be a little awkward. People will say, maybe a little less faith-based, a little more reality-based.